The blood on Flora's dress had dried to a dark rust color by the time she pushed through the doors of the whitewashed church in Roswell, New Mexico. And every head in the congregation turned to stare at her entrance on that scorching July morning in 1883. She held her chin high despite the torn fabric that hung from her shoulder, exposing the white chemise beneath, despite the cuts on her hands and the dirt smeared across her face. The hem of her dress was shredded, and her boots were caked with mud and something darker. She had walked 3 miles from the wreckage, and she would not apologize for her appearance. Behind her, the double doors swung shut with a soft thud that echoed through the sudden silence. The preacher, mid-sermon, had stopped speaking. Women clutched their fans and whispered behind gloved hands. Men frowned and shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Flora Dalton had nowhere else to go. The stagecoach attack had left her stranded, her belongings stolen or scattered across the desert floor. The driver was dead. The other passenger, an elderly woman traveling to see her daughter, had taken a bullet to the chest and died in Flora's arms before the bandits even finished ransacking their luggage. Flora had hidden behind a rock formation until the men rode off, then walked until she saw the town rising from the dusty landscape like a mirage. She took a step forward, her boots loud against the wooden floor. A child started to cry. Someone coughed. Flora could feel the weight of judgment pressing against her skin, heavier than the heat that had beaten down on her during her walk. She knew what they saw. A woman alone, disheveled, possibly mad. A woman who did not belong in this sacred space with her torn clothing and wild appearance. Then a man stood up from a pew near the back. He was tall, with broad shoulders that filled out his Sunday shirt, and he wore a string tie that looked uncomfortable in the heat. His face was weathered, tanned from long hours under the sun, and his dark hair was neatly combed back. He could not have been much older than 25, perhaps 26. His eyes, a striking gray-blue color, met hers across the space, and there was no judgment in them, only concern. Samuel Irving did not think. He simply moved. His hands went to his coat, the good wool one he saved for church and special occasions, and he shrugged it off as he walked down the aisle toward the woman who looked like she had walked through hell itself. The congregation watched in stunned silence as he approached her. Up close, he could see the exhaustion in her face, the way her jaw was set against what must have been overwhelming fatigue and fear. Her eyes were green, he noticed, a deep forest green that held both defiance and desperation. "Madam," he said quietly, and his voice was gentle, roughened by years of calling to cattle and horses across open ranges. He held out the coat. "You look like you could use this." Flora stared at him. Her throat felt tight, and she realized with horror that tears were threatening to spill over. She had not cried when the bullets started flying. She had not cried when she held the dying woman and felt her take her last breath. She had not cried during the long, brutal walk under the merciless sun. But this simple act of kindness, offered without question or demand, nearly broke something inside her. "I don't need charity," she managed to say, but her voice cracked on the last word. "It is not charity," Samuel said. "It is Sunday and you came to worship. Everyone deserves dignity in the house of God." He stepped closer and gently draped the coat over her shoulders. It was too large for her, but it was warm from his body heat and smelled of soap and sage. It covered the torn parts of her dress, the bloodstains, the evidence of violence. Then he did something that made the congregation gasp collectively. He gestured to his pew, the one he shared with no one since his parents had passed 2 years prior. "Sit with me," he said. It was not a question or a command, but an invitation. Flora looked at the pew, then back at his face. She saw no pity there, no condescension, just genuine human decency. She nodded once, unable to speak, and let him guide her to the wooden bench. She sat down carefully, her body aching from the ordeal, and he sat beside her, creating a barrier between her and the staring eyes of the town. The preacher, Reverend Michaels, cleared his throat and attempted to resume his sermon, but his words were hollow in the aftermath of what everyone had just witnessed. Samuel Irving, one of the most respected ranchers in the territory, despite his young age, had just publicly aligned himself with a strange woman who had walked into church looking like a victim of some terrible crime. The implications would be discussed in every parlor and over every dinner table in Roswell before nightfall. Samuel did not care about the implications. He had been raised by parents who believed that faith was demonstrated through actions, not just words. His mother, God rest her soul, would have done the same. She would have given the coat off her back and the last piece of bread from her table to someone in need. He had learned from her that kindness did not require understanding or explanation. It simply required heart. Beside him, the woman sat rigidly, her hands folded in her lap. He could see them shaking slightly. Without drawing attention to the movement, he reached over and placed his hand over hers, just for a moment, a silent message that she was safe here. She did not pull away. Instead, her fingers curled slightly, accepting the comfort. The sermon dragged on. Samuel could not have repeated a single word of it afterward. His attention was focused on the woman beside him, on the way her breathing gradually slowed from the rapid, shallow gasps of someone in shock to something more normal. He noticed details. The quality of her dress beneath the damage suggested she was not poor. The careful stitching and good fabric spoke of means. Her hands, though cut and dirty, were not the hands of someone accustomed to hard labor. The nails were neat, the fingers long and elegant. She wore a small locket around her neck, gold and delicate, that had somehow survived whatever had happened to her. When the congregation rose to sing, Samuel stood and offered his hymnal, pointing to the words. Flora looked at the page but did not sing. Her lips pressed together, and he saw her blinking rapidly. He did not push. He simply stood beside her, his presence a steady anchor in what must have felt like a storm of unwanted attention. Finally, mercifully, the service ended. The congregation began to file out, but Samuel noticed how many people were lingering, pretending to gather their belongings slowly while stealing glances at his pew. He stood and offered his hand to help Flora rise. She took it, her grip surprisingly strong despite her obvious exhaustion. "Come on," he said quietly. "Let us get out of here before the questions start." But they were not fast enough. Reverend Michaels approached, his face a mixture of concern and curiosity. "Brother Irving," he said, his eyes flickering to Flora, "perhaps you could introduce your guest." Samuel felt Flora stiffen beside him. "This is Miss Flora Dalton," he said, pulling the name from thin air and then realizing she had not actually told him her name. He looked at her, hoping he had not just made a terrible assumption. "Yes," Flora said, her voice hoarse. "Flora Dalton." "I apologize for the disruption, Reverend. There was an incident on the road." "An incident?" The Reverend's eyebrows rose. "My dear, you look like you have been through something terrible. Should we fetch the sheriff?" "No," Flora said quickly, too quickly. Then she moderated her tone. "I mean, yes, the sheriff should be informed. The stagecoach was attacked about 3 miles south of town. The driver is dead, as is another passenger, but I would very much like to clean up and perhaps have some water before I give a statement." The Reverend's face paled. "The stage was attacked." "Good Lord. Yes, yes, of course. Mrs. Henley, could you fetch the sheriff?" He turned to a stout woman who had been hovering nearby. She nodded and hurried off, clearly thrilled to have been given such an important task. "Miss Dalton needs rest and care," Samuel said firmly. I will take her to the doctor, and then we can deal with the authorities." "That would be most appropriate," the Reverend said, "though perhaps one of the ladies should accompany you, for propriety's sake." Samuel wanted to point out that propriety seemed less important than getting this exhausted woman medical attention, but he held his tongue. "Mrs. Patterson," he called to an older woman he knew had a kind heart, "would you mind coming with us to Doc Wheeler's, Mrs. Patterson, a widow in her 60s with silver hair and sharp eyes, nodded immediately. "Of course, Samuel. Come along, dear," she said to Flora, and there was genuine warmth in her voice. "Let us get you sorted out." The three of them made their way out of the church, running a gauntlet of curious stares and whispered conversations. Samuel kept his hand lightly on Flora's elbow, a gesture of support rather than possession, and he could feel her leaning into him slightly, using his strength to keep herself upright. The July heat hit them like a physical blow when they stepped outside. The sun was merciless, turning the dusty main street of Roswell into a shimmering mirage. Samuel's horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Ranger, was tied up at the hitching post outside the church. He untied the reins and led the horse alongside them as they walked toward the doctor's office. "How far did you walk?" Mrs. Patterson asked Flora, her voice gentle. 3 miles, perhaps a bit more," Flora replied. "I am not entirely certain. Everything looks the same out there." "In this heat and in your condition, that must have been brutal," the older woman said. "You are very brave, my dear." "I did not feel brave," Flora admitted. "I simply kept putting one foot in front of the other because the alternative was to lie down and die, and I am too stubborn for that." Despite the grim circumstances, Samuel felt a smile tug at his lips. Stubborn. Yes, he could see that in her. There was steel in this woman, underneath the exhaustion and trauma. Doc Wheeler's office was in a small building near the center of town, identifiable by the shingle hanging outside. Samuel knocked once and then pushed the door open. The interior was blessedly cool, the thick adobe walls keeping out the worst of the heat. The doctor, a man in his 50s with thinning hair and spectacles, looked up from his desk where he had been writing in a ledger. "Samuel," he said in greeting, then his eyes landed on Flora and widened. "Good God, what happened?" "Stage attack," Samuel said briefly. 3 miles south. Miss Dalton here was the only survivor. Doc Wheeler was already moving, guiding Flora to a chair and beginning his examination. "Mrs. Patterson, could you help Miss Dalton with her dress?" "I need to check for injuries." "Samuel, you wait outside." Samuel started to protest, then caught himself. Of course he needed to leave. It would be highly inappropriate for him to be present during a medical examination. He nodded and stepped back outside into the heat, closing the door behind him. He leaned against the hitching post and tried to process what had just happened. He had gone to church expecting a normal Sunday service. Instead, he had met a woman who had literally walked through tragedy and somehow maintained her dignity and strength. He had given her his coat and his pew without thinking, acting on instinct and upbringing. Now he found himself deeply concerned about a person he had known for less than an hour. The sheriff, a grizzled man named Tom Brennan, came striding up the street with Mrs. Henley trailing behind him. "Samuel," he said with a nod, "heard there was trouble with the stage." "Inside with Doc Wheeler," Samuel replied. "Sole survivor. She said the driver and another passenger were killed." The sheriff's face hardened. "Did she see the attackers?" "I have not had a chance to ask for details." "She only just got to town, walked 3 miles in this heat." Sheriff Brennan whistled low. "Tough woman. I will need to talk to her, but I will give her a few minutes with the doc first." "You know her?" "No," Samuel admitted. "She walked into church and I could see she needed help." The sheriff gave him a long look. "That was decent of you, son. Town will talk, though. "Let them talk," Samuel said with a shrug. "I did what was right." "Your pa would be proud," Sheriff Brennan said, and there was approval in his voice. "I will wait here. Need to get a posse together and ride out to the stage, see if we can pick up a trail." They waited in silence, the heat pressing down on them. Samuel found himself anxiously watching the door, waiting for some sign that Flora was all right. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 20 minutes, the door opened and Mrs. Patterson emerged. "She is going to be fine," the older woman said. "Cut up and bruised, dehydrated, but nothing broken. Doc is cleaning her wounds and giving her water. She is a strong girl, that one." Most women would have collapsed from what she went through. Relief flooded through Samuel, surprising him with its intensity. "Good," he said. "That is good." "Sheriff needs to talk to her," Sheriff Brennan said. "Is she up for that?" "Give her another few minutes," Mrs. Patterson said firmly. "The girl needs a moment to breathe." The sheriff nodded and settled in to wait. Samuel remained by the door, feeling oddly protective of a woman he barely knew. It made no logical sense, but then again, matters of the heart rarely did. When Flora finally emerged, she looked transformed. Her face was clean, her hands were bandaged, and someone had helped her pin up her hair into something resembling order. She still wore Samuel's coat over her ruined dress, but she stood straighter now, some of her strength restored by medical attention and water. "Miss Dalton," Sheriff Brennan said, removing his hat. "I am sorry for your ordeal, but I need to ask you some questions." Flora nodded. "Of course. What do you need to know?" "Let us go to my office," the sheriff said. "You can sit down while we talk." They made their way to the sheriff's office, a small building with a jail cell in the back. Flora sat in the chair the sheriff offered, and Samuel stood nearby, unwilling to leave her alone despite knowing it was not his place to stay. Flora did not object to his presence. If anything, she seemed to draw strength from it. She told her story in a clear, steady voice describing the attack. 4 men masked, armed with rifles and pistols. They had shot the driver first, before the stage even stopped. Then they had forced the door open and dragged out the strong box that had been stored under the seat. When the elderly woman, Mrs. Abernathy, had cried out in fear, one of the men had shot her without hesitation. "They took everything," Flora said, her voice finally showing some strain. "Money, bags, even Mrs. Abernathy's wedding ring. They laughed while they did it. One of them looked right at me where I was hiding and said there was no point chasing me down in the heat. He said the desert would finish me off and save them a bullet." Samuel felt anger rising in his chest. "Did you recognize any of them?" "No," Flora said. "They wore bandanas over their faces, but one of them had a distinctive horse, a paint with brown and white markings, and another had a scar on his forearm, visible below his sleeve. It looked like a burned scar." Sheriff Brennan was taking notes. "That is good information, Miss Dalton. Very observant, especially under such circumstances. I will get a posse together and ride out to the scene. Maybe we can pick up their trail." "They headed east," Flora said. "At least, that is the direction they rode when they left." "East toward the territory line," the sheriff muttered. "Probably planning to cross over and lay low. We will do what we can." He looked at Flora with sympathy. "You got somewhere to stay tonight? Family in town?" Flora hesitated. "No," she admitted. "I was traveling to Santa Fe to take a position as a governess. I have no one in Roswell." "The boarding house," Mrs. Patterson spoke up. She had followed them to the sheriff's office, appointed herself as Flora's guardian. "Mrs. Murphy runs a respectable place. We can get you a room there." "I have no money," Flora said quietly, and Samuel could see how much the admission cost her pride. "They took everything." "We will work something out," Mrs. Patterson said firmly. "Do not you worry about that." Samuel spoke up before he could second-guess himself. I will cover the cost of the room and whatever else Miss Dalton needs to get back on her feet. Consider it a loan if that makes it easier to accept," he added, seeing Flora's mouth open to protest. "Mr. Irving, I cannot possibly accept," Flora began. "You can and you will," Samuel said, his tone brooking no argument. "You have been through hell today, pardon my language. Let someone help you." Their eyes met and something passed between them, an understanding that went beyond words. Flora finally nodded. "A loan," she said. "I will pay you back every cent. When you are able," Samuel agreed. "No rush," Sheriff Brennan stood up. "I need to get that posse together. Miss Dalton, you stay in town until we have a chance to catch these men. We might need you to identify them." "I will be here," Flora said. They left the sheriff's office, and Mrs. Patterson took charge of getting Flora settled at the boarding house. Samuel walked with them, leading Ranger. The boarding house was a 2-story building painted yellow, with a wide porch and rocking chairs outside. Mrs. Murphy, the proprietress, was a formidable woman in her 40s who listened to the story with appropriate horror and immediately agreed to provide Flora with a room. "Poor dear," she said, looking Flora up and down. "We will get you fed and into a proper bath. You look dead on your feet." "I feel dead on my feet," Flora admitted. Samuel pulled out his wallet and paid for a week's room and board in advance, ignoring Flora's protests. "You need time to recover and figure out your next steps," he said. "This gives you that time without having to worry." Flora looked at him for a long moment. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "You do not know me. You do not owe me anything." Samuel considered the question. Why was he doing this? He could give her the easy answer about Christian charity and helping those in need. But the truth was more complicated. From the moment he had seen her standing in the doorway of that church, bloodied but unbowed, he had felt something shift inside him. Recognition, perhaps, of a kindred spirit. A sense that this meeting was significant in ways he could not yet understand. "Because you needed help and I was able to give it," he said finally. "That is reason enough." Flora's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Thank you," she said softly. "I will never forget this kindness." "Get some rest," Samuel said. "I will check on you tomorrow if that is acceptable." "It would be welcome," Flora replied. Samuel left the boarding house and rode back to his ranch, his mind full of thoughts of green eyes and quiet courage. The ranch, the triple I for Irving, was 5 miles outside of town, a spread of decent grazing land with a small herd of cattle and a sturdy house his father had built with his own hands. Samuel had inherited it all when his parents died of influenza 2 winters past, and he had been running it alone with the help of a few hired hands ever since his foreman, an older Mexican man named Miguel, met him at the barn. "You are back late from church," Miguel observed. "There was an incident," Samuel said, and proceeded to tell Miguel about the stage attack and the woman he had helped. Miguel listened carefully, then nodded. "You did right, patron. This woman, she has nowhere to go. She was traveling to Santa Fe for work. Now she is stuck here until the sheriff catches the men who attacked the stage." "And you paid for her room," Miguel said. "It was not a question." "Yes," Miguel smiled slightly. "Your mother would be proud. She always said you had her heart." Samuel unsaddled Ranger and brushed the horse down, the familiar routine calming his thoughts. But he could not stop thinking about Flora, wondering if she was all right, hoping the bath and food and rest would help her recover from the trauma. He found himself already planning his visit to town the next day, wanting to check on her but not wanting to seem too forward or presumptuous. That night, he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. His mind kept replaying the moment when Flora had walked into the church, the way she had held her head high despite everything. The way her hand had felt under his when he had offered that brief moment of comfort, the green of her eyes. He had not thought much about marriage or courting in the 2 years since his parents died. There had been too much work, too much responsibility, and too much grief. The occasional town social had been obligation rather than pleasure, and the few women who had made their interest clear had failed to spark any interest in return. But now, lying in the dark, Samuel found himself thinking about possibilities. It was too soon, he told himself. She had just survived a traumatic attack. She was vulnerable, in shock, not in any state to think about romance. But he could not deny the pull he felt, the desire to see her again, to make sure she was safe and healing. In town, Flora lay in a soft bed in the boarding house and stared at the faded wallpaper, unable to sleep despite her exhaustion. The hot bath had eased her aching muscles, and the meal Mrs. Murphy had provided had filled her empty stomach, but her mind would not rest. She kept seeing Mrs. Abernathy's face, the shock and pain in her eyes as the bullet struck. She kept hearing the laughter of the bandits as they rifled through her belongings, but she also kept thinking about the cowboy who had given her his coat and his pew. Samuel Irving. He had not asked invasive questions or demanded explanations. He had simply helped, with no expectation of anything in return. It had been so long since anyone had shown her such uncomplicated kindness. Flora's life before this day had not been easy. She was the daughter of a failed shopkeeper who had drunk himself to death, leaving her mother to struggle alone until consumption took her 3 years later. Flora had been 19 when her mother died, leaving her alone in St. Louis with no money and few prospects. She had worked as a seamstress, barely scraping by, until she had seen an advertisement for a governess position in Santa Fe. The pay had been good, room and board included, and it had seemed like a chance to start fresh somewhere new. Now that chance was gone, stolen by bandits along with everything else she owned. She had the clothes on her back, and those were ruined. She had the locket around her neck, her mother's locket, which they had somehow missed in their looting. And she had a debt to a kind stranger that she had no idea how to repay. Flora was not used to depending on others. She had learned early that the only person she could truly rely on was herself. But right now, exhausted and traumatized and far from anywhere she knew, she had no choice but to accept help. The thought made her uncomfortable, but it also made her grateful. Samuel Irving had not looked at her with pity or contempt. He had looked at her like she was a person worthy of respect and dignity, and that meant more than he could possibly know. She finally fell asleep as dawn was breaking, and she slept deeply, her body demanding rest even as her mind churned with worry and plans. Samuel rode into town the next afternoon, telling himself it was to check on the progress of the sheriff's posse, but knowing in his heart it was to see Flora. He stopped first at the sheriff's office, where he learned that the posse had found the stagecoach and the bodies, but the trail of the bandits had gone cold at a rocky stretch where tracks disappeared. "We will keep looking," Sheriff Brennan said grimly. But they had a good head start, and they knew what they were doing. From there, Samuel made his way to the boarding house. Mrs. Murphy answered his knock and gave him a knowing smile. "She is in the parlor," the landlady said. "Been sitting there most of the day, looking lost. I think your visit will do her good." Samuel found Flora sitting in a rocking chair near the window, staring out at the street. She wore a simple cotton dress that Mrs. Murphy must have lent her, pale blue and a bit too large. Her hair was down, hanging in loose waves past her shoulders, and she looked younger than she had the day before, more vulnerable. She turned when she heard his footsteps, and a genuine smile lit up her face. "Mr. Irving," she said, starting to rise. "Please do not get up," Samuel said, removing his hat. And call me Samuel. Mr. Irving was my father." "Then you must call me Flora," she replied, settling back into the chair. Samuel pulled up another chair and sat down, placing his hat on his knee. "How are you feeling today?" "Better," Flora said. "Physically, at least. The cuts are healing, and I no longer feel like I might collapse at any moment. Mentally, it is harder. I keep seeing what happened over and over." "That is natural," Samuel said gently. "Give yourself time. You went through something terrible. Mrs. Abernathy did not deserve to die like that," Flora said, her voice tight with suppressed emotion. "She was just a grandmother going to see her daughter's new baby. She showed me a photograph. A tiny little girl named Alice. Now that baby will grow up never knowing her grandmother." Samuel reached over and took Flora's hand, a gesture that felt natural despite their short acquaintance. "It was not your fault," he said firmly. "You could not have stopped it." "I know," Flora whispered, "but knowing and feeling are different things." They sat in silence for a moment, his hand warm over hers. Then Flora seemed to shake herself, pulling her emotions back under control. "Did the sheriff find anything?" she asked. Samuel told her about the posse's lack of success. Flora's face fell. "So they will get away with it." "Maybe not," Samuel said. "The sheriff is not giving up, and word will spread. Someone might recognize the description of the men or their horses." Flora nodded, but she did not look convinced. "What happens now?" she asked. "I cannot stay here forever, living on your charity. I need to find work, earn money, move on with my life." "What kind of work can you do?" Samuel asked. "I can sew," Flora said. "I worked as a seamstress for several years. I am also educated. I can read and write and do figures. That was why I was traveling to be a governess. I had thought to teach, maybe, but positions are hard to come by without connections." Samuel had an idea, but he was not sure if he should voice it. It seemed too convenient, too much like he was trying to engineer a situation to keep her near. But it also made practical sense. "My ranch house is a mess," he said slowly. "Since my mother died, I have been living like a bachelor, eating poorly, letting things fall apart. I could use someone to help with the domestic side of things. Cooking, cleaning, maybe some mending. It would just be during the day. You would stay here in town at night, and I would pay you a fair wage." Flora looked at him searchingly. "You do not have to create work for me out of pity." "It is not pity," Samuel said. "I genuinely need the help. Ask Miguel, my foreman. He has been complaining about the state of the house for months." "What would people say?" Flora asked. "A single woman working alone for a single man. You would not be alone. Miguel is there and the other hands, and you would leave each afternoon and go back to town. It would be no different than if I hired you to work in a shop or a saloon, and it pays better." Flora considered this. The offer was generous, perhaps too generous, but she needed work, needed a way to support herself and pay back the money Samuel had already spent on her. And if she was honest with herself, she wanted to spend more time with him. There was something about Samuel Irving that made her feel safe, that made the horror of the past day seem a little less overwhelming. "All right," she said finally. "I will try it. But if it does not work out, or if people talk too much, I will find something else." "Fair enough," Samuel said, and his smile was like sunshine. "Can you start tomorrow?" "Yes," Flora said. "What time should I come to the ranch?" "I will pick you up at 7 in the morning," Samuel said. "Is that too early?" "Not at all," Flora replied. "I am used to rising early." They talked for another hour, the conversation flowing easily between them. Samuel told her about the ranch, about his parents, and how he had inherited the land. Flora told him about her life in St. Louis, carefully editing out the worst of the poverty and struggle but giving him a sense of who she was. They discovered shared interests. Both loved to read, though books were hard to come by on the frontier. Both appreciated the stark beauty of the desert landscape. Both had a tendency to see humor in difficult situations. When Samuel finally stood to leave, the sun was setting outside, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. "I will see you tomorrow morning," he said. "I will be ready," Flora promised. That night, Flora lay in bed with her mind full of possibilities instead of nightmares. Tomorrow she would start working, earning her own way again. And she would spend time with Samuel, getting to know the man who had showed her such unexpected kindness. It was not the future she had planned when she boarded the stagecoach in St. Louis, but perhaps it was the future she was meant to have. Samuel arrived at the boarding house at exactly 7 the next morning, driving a wagon instead of riding Ranger. Flora was waiting on the porch, wearing the borrowed blue dress and a bonnet Mrs. Murphy had provided. She looked fresh and pretty in the morning light, and Samuel felt his heart do something strange in his chest. He helped her up onto the wagon seat, his hands lingering a moment longer than necessary at her waist. She did not seem to mind. They rode out of town toward the ranch, the morning air still relatively cool before the brutal heat of the day set in. The Triple I Ranch sprawled across a valley with low hills rising on either side. The house itself was adobe, built to withstand the heat, with a covered porch that wrapped around 2 sides. There was a barn, a bunkhouse for the hands, several corrals and outbuildings for equipment. Cattle grazed in the distance, dark shapes against the pale grass. "It is beautiful," Flora said honestly. "You must love it here." "I do," Samuel said. "My father chose this spot. He said it had good bones, whatever that means, but he was right. The land is good for cattle. There is water from a spring up in the hills, and the house stays relatively cool even in summer." He helped her down from the wagon and led her inside. The house was indeed a mess. Dishes were piled in the kitchen, dust covered every surface, and clothes were draped over chairs. Flora could see what had been a lovely home beneath the neglect, with good furniture and careful construction. "I am sorry for the state of things," Samuel said, looking embarrassed. "I know it is bad." "It is nothing that cannot be fixed," Flora said, already mentally cataloging what needed to be done. "Do you have cleaning supplies?" Samuel showed her where things were kept, then retreated to work outside, leaving her to it. Flora rolled up her sleeves and got to work. She started with the dishes, heating water on the stove and scrubbing until her hands were red. Then she tackled the dusting and sweeping, working her way through the house room by room. Miguel came in around mid-morning to meet her. He was a man in his 50s with graying hair and kind eyes, and he looked at Flora with approval. "It is good to have a woman's touch here again," he said in accented but clear English. "Samuel Irving, she would be happy to see someone caring for her home." "I will do my best," Flora said. "Samuel is a good man," Miguel said, and there was a pointed quality to his words. "He deserves happiness. He has been alone too long." Flora felt herself blushing. "I am just here to work," Miguel smiled. "Of course. But maybe in time it will be more. God works in mysterious ways, no." He left her to her work, and Flora tried to push the implications of his words out of her mind. But she could not help thinking about Samuel as she cleaned his house, noticing small details that spoke to his character. Books on the shelf, well worn from reading. A photograph of his parents on the mantel, their faces kind and weathered. Everything of quality but not ostentation, functional but cared for. She found herself wanting to restore the home to what it must have been when his mother was alive, to give Samuel back that sense of comfort and care. It was more than just work. It was a gift she could give him in return for his kindness. By noon, the main room and kitchen were transformed. Samuel came in for the midday meal and stopped short, staring around in amazement. "Flora, this is incredible," he said. "I did not think it could look like this again." "It just needed attention," Flora said, pleased by his reaction. "I made stew for lunch. I hope that is all right. I found vegetables in the root cellar and some beef in the cold box." They ate together at the table, which Flora had scrubbed clean and covered with a cloth she found in a chest. The food was simple but well prepared, and Samuel ate like a man who had been living on jerky and hardtack for too long. "This is the best meal I have had in 2 years," he said between bites. "Then you have been suffering," Flora said with a laugh. "It is just stew." "It is more than that," Samuel said, his eyes meeting hers. "It is coming into a clean house and sitting down to a meal someone else prepared with care. It is feeling like this place is a home again instead of just somewhere I sleep." Flora felt warmth spreading through her chest. "I am glad I can help," she said softly. After lunch, Samuel reluctantly returned to work and Flora continued cleaning. She tackled the bedrooms next, changing linens and dusting and organizing. In Samuel's room, she found herself lingering, taking in the personal details. A razor on the washstand, a worn Bible on the nightstand. Clothes hung neatly despite the disorder in the rest of the house. She smoothed the quilt on his bed, a patchwork pattern his mother must have made, and felt an odd intimacy in the act. When Samuel drove her back to town that evening, they talked easily about the day, about her plans for cleaning the rest of the house, about his work with the cattle. It felt natural, comfortable, like they had known each other for years instead of days. This became their routine. Every morning, Samuel would pick Flora up at the boarding house and drive her to the ranch. She would spend the day cooking and cleaning and mending, transforming the house back into a home. He would work with Miguel and the hands, managing the cattle and the land. They would eat lunch together, and then dinner before he drove her back to town. And every day they grew closer. Flora learned that Samuel had a quiet sense of humor, that he was patient with animals and fair with his workers, that he read poetry when he thought no one was looking. Samuel learned that Flora had a stubborn streak a mile wide, that she sang while she worked, that she was far more educated than most women on the frontier, that she had dreams of teaching children someday. They began to rely on each other's company, to look forward to their time together. Samuel found excuses to come into the house during the day, needing a drink of water or checking on something that did not really need checking. Flora found reasons to bring lunch out to where he was working, wanting to see him in his element, confident and capable. The people of Roswell noticed. Of course they noticed. A single woman spending every day at a single man's ranch was fodder for gossip, even if everything was perfectly proper. Mrs. Patterson defended Flora's reputation fiercely, pointing out that she stayed at the boarding house every night and that there were always ranch hands present during the day. But the whispers continued. Samuel heard the talk and felt anger rising. "It is not right," he said to Miguel one afternoon. "She is working honestly, doing nothing wrong, and people treat her like some kind of scandalous woman." "Welcome to small-town life," Miguel said with a shrug. "People talk because they have nothing better to do, but you know what would stop the talk?" "What?" "Marry her." Samuel stared at his foreman. "We have only known each other for 3 weeks." "Your parents knew each other for 2 weeks before your father proposed," Miguel pointed out. "When you know, you know. And you know, patron, I see how you look at her. I see how she looks at you. You are both dancing around what is obvious to everyone else." Samuel could not deny it. In 3 weeks, Flora had become essential to his life. He woke thinking about seeing her. He went to sleep thinking about their conversations. He found himself planning a future that included her, imagining her not just working in his house but living in it, sharing his life in every way. But was it fair to ask her? She had been through trauma. She was dependent on him for income and shelter. He did not want her to feel obligated or pressured. He wanted her to choose him freely, without any sense of debt or desperation. That Sunday, they attended church together, arriving separately but sitting in the same pew. It had become their habit. Samuel would save her a seat, and she would arrive just after the service started, sliding in beside him. They would share a hymnal and listen to Reverend Michaels preach, and afterward they would walk out together, heads high despite the whispers. This particular Sunday, the Reverend preached on Ruth and Boaz, the story of a foreign woman who found refuge and love in a strange land. Samuel felt the words hitting close to home, and he glanced at Flora to see her wiping tears from her eyes. He reached over and took her hand, right there in church where everyone could see, and she laced her fingers through his and held on. After the service, they walked slowly back toward the boarding house, neither wanting to part. The July heat was oppressive, but they barely noticed. They were too focused on each other. "Flora," Samuel said, stopping in the shade of a cottonwood tree near the edge of town, "I need to say something, and I hope I am not speaking out of turn." Flora's heart began to race. "What is it?" Samuel took both her hands in his gray-blue eyes intense. "These past weeks, having you at the ranch, getting to know you, it has been the happiest I have been since my parents died. Maybe happier than I have ever been. You make everything better just by being there. And I know it has only been a short time, and I know you have been through something terrible, and maybe I should wait longer before saying this, but I am not a man who plays games or hides his feelings." "Samuel," Flora whispered, barely daring to breathe. "I am falling in love with you," Samuel said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I think I started falling for you the moment I saw you walk into that church, so brave and strong, and every day since has just made me more certain. I want you in my life, Flora. Not just as someone who works at my ranch, but as my partner, my wife, if you will have me." Flora felt tears streaming down her face, but they were happy tears. "You are not saying this because you feel sorry for me?" she asked. "Or because you feel responsible for me?" "No," Samuel said firmly. "I am saying it because I cannot imagine my life without you in it. Because when I think about the future, you are in every picture. Because I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep next to you every night. Because I love you, Flora Dalton, and I want to marry you." Flora let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "I love you too," she said. "I think I have loved you since you gave me your coat and did not ask a single question. You made me feel like a person again when I thought I had lost everything, and these past weeks have been the happiest of my life. So yes, Samuel Irving, I will marry you." Samuel let out a whoop of joy and swept her up in his arms, spinning her around. When he set her down, he cupped her face in his hands and kissed her, right there on the main street of Roswell for anyone to see. Flora kissed him back, pouring all her love and gratitude and joy into the connection. When they finally broke apart, they were both grinning like fools. "When?" Flora asked breathlessly. "As soon as possible," Samuel said. "Tomorrow, if Reverend Michaels will do it." "People will really talk then," Flora said, but she was laughing. "Let them talk," Samuel said. "I am done caring what anyone thinks. I want you to be my wife, and I do not want to wait." They went directly to Reverend Michael's house and found him in his garden, tending to vegetables. He looked up in surprise as they approached, hand in hand and flushed with happiness. "Reverend," Samuel said, "Flora and I want to get married. Will you perform the ceremony?" The Reverend's eyebrows rose. "That is wonderful news, though rather sudden. When were you thinking?" "Tomorrow," Samuel said. "Tomorrow." The Reverend looked startled. "My boy, that is quite hasty. Are you certain?" "More certain than I have ever been about anything," Samuel said. Flora nodded her agreement. The Reverend looked between them, seeing the love and conviction in their faces, and slowly smiled. "Well then, who am I to stand in the way of young love? Tomorrow it is." Shall we say 2 in the afternoon? That will give me time to prepare and give you time to arrange for witnesses." They thanked him profusely and left, their hands still clasped. They spent the rest of the afternoon making plans. Flora would need a dress. Mrs. Murphy and Mrs. Patterson, when informed of the upcoming wedding, were thrilled and immediately volunteered to help. Mrs. Murphy had a dress from her own wedding that could be altered to fit Flora, and Mrs. Patterson knew of a woman who could do the alterations quickly. Samuel rode out to the ranch to tell Miguel, who grinned widely and said he had known it was only a matter of time. He agreed to stand as witness for Samuel, along with one of the other ranch hands, a young man named Tom who had worked for the Irving family for years. That night, lying in her bed at the boarding house, Flora could hardly believe what was happening. In less than 24 hours, she would be married. She would be Flora Irving, wife of a rancher, living in New Mexico instead of working as a governess in Santa Fe. Life had taken a turn she never could have predicted, and she was grateful beyond words. The next afternoon, Flora stood in the church wearing a dress of cream-colored silk that had been hastily altered to fit her. Mrs. Murphy and Mrs. Patterson had stayed up half the night making adjustments, and the result was beautiful. Flora's hair was pinned up with small white flowers that Mrs. Patterson had picked from her garden that morning, and she carried a simple bouquet of wildflowers. The church was not full, but there were more people than Flora had expected. Word had spread quickly about the wedding, and curious townspeople had shown up to witness the marriage of the mysterious woman from the stage attack and the respected young rancher who had helped her. Samuel stood at the front of the church in his best suit, the same one he had worn every Sunday, and his face when he saw Flora walking down the aisle took her breath away. He looked at her like she was the most precious thing in the world, and Flora felt her heart swelling with love. The ceremony was simple and traditional. They spoke their vows in clear, strong voices, promising to love and honor each other for the rest of their lives. Samuel's hands were steady as he slipped a gold band onto Flora's finger, a ring that had belonged to his mother. Flora had no ring to give him, but he did not care. He said having her as his wife was gift enough. "I now pronounce you man and wife," Reverend Michaels said with a warm smile. "Samuel, you may kiss your bride." Samuel pulled Flora into his arms and kissed her with all the love and passion he had been holding back for weeks. The small congregation clapped and cheered, and even the gossips had to admit that the couple looked genuinely happy. After the ceremony, Mrs. Murphy hosted a small reception at the boarding house, with cake and lemonade. People came by to offer congratulations, and Flora was touched by how many were genuinely kind. Even those who had whispered about impropriety now seemed willing to accept her as Samuel's wife, and therefore a respectable member of the community. As evening approached, Samuel brought the wagon around. He had tied ribbons to the sides, and Miguel had added a hand-painted, "Just Married" sign to the back. Flora laughed when she saw it, delighted by the gesture. They drove out to the ranch as the sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant colors. The house, clean and welcoming thanks to Flora's weeks of work, waited for them. This was home now, Flora realized. Not the boarding house in town, but this adobe ranch house in the middle of the New Mexico territory, with a man she had known for less than a month, but felt like she had known forever. Samuel carried her over the threshold, a tradition he insisted on despite Flora's laughing protests that it was silly. He set her down in the main room and pulled her close, his arms around her waist. "Hello, Mrs. Irving," he said softly. "Hello, husband," Flora replied, loving the way the word felt in her mouth. They spent their wedding night learning each other, discovering the joy of physical intimacy paired with deep emotional connection. Samuel was gentle and patient, making sure Flora felt safe and cherished. Flora was surprised by her own passion, by how natural it felt to be with him this way. They fell asleep wrapped around each other, content and complete. The next morning, Flora woke to sunlight streaming through the window and Samuel's arm draped over her waist. She turned carefully to look at him, studying his face in sleep. He looked younger, more peaceful, and she felt overwhelming tenderness for this man who had changed her life so completely. His eyes opened, and he smiled when he saw her watching him. "Good morning, wife. Good morning, husband." They lingered in bed longer than they should have, talking and laughing and stealing kisses. Eventually, duty called. Samuel had cattle to tend and Flora had a household to run, but everything felt different now. This was their home, their life together, the beginning of their shared future. The weeks turned into months, and Flora settled into her new life with surprising ease. She had feared that marriage to a man she barely knew would be difficult, full of awkward adjustments and uncomfortable discoveries. Instead, she and Samuel fit together like pieces of a puzzle. They balanced each other, his quiet strength complementing her practical determination, her education and wit engaging his thoughtful nature. The ranch prospered under their joint care. Flora took over not just the domestic tasks, but also the bookkeeping, discovering she had a head for numbers and business. She made suggestions for improvements that Samuel readily implemented, recognizing her intelligence and trusting her judgment. Miguel told Samuel repeatedly that he was a lucky man, and Samuel agreed wholeheartedly. In September, Sheriff Brennan came to the ranch with news. They had caught the men who attacked the stage. One of them had tried to sell Mrs. Abernathy's distinctive wedding ring in a town 50 miles away, and an alert shopkeeper had recognized the description from wanted posters the sheriff had circulated. The men had been arrested and would stand trial. "We will need you to testify," the sheriff told Flora. "To identify them and tell the jury what happened." Flora felt old fear rising but pushed it down. "Of course," she said. "Whatever is needed to see justice done." The trial was held in October, and Flora sat in the courtroom with Samuel beside her, his hand holding hers tightly. She told her story once again, in front of a room full of strangers, describing in detail the attack and its aftermath. When the defense lawyer tried to suggest she was mistaken or exaggerating, Samuel had to be physically restrained from charging at the man. Flora placed a calming hand on his arm and answered every question with dignity and precision. The jury found all 4 men guilty of murder and robbery. They were sentenced to hang. Flora felt no joy in the verdict, just a sense of closure. Mrs. Abernathy's death had been avenged, though it would not bring her back. The elderly woman's daughter attended the trial and thanked Flora afterward, tears streaming down her face. "My mother would want you to know that she thought you were very brave," the daughter said. "In her last moments, she said so. She said you were strong and that you would survive." Flora accepted the words like the gift they were. Another piece of healing in the process of moving forward from tragedy. Back at the ranch, life continued its steady rhythm. Samuel and Flora grew closer with each passing day, their love deepening from passionate infatuation to something more solid and enduring. They learned how to fight fairly, how to forgive quickly, how to support each other through difficulties. They learned each other's habits and preferences, the small, intimate details that made up a shared life. In November, Flora realized she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, but had not been certain until the doctor confirmed it. She was nervous about telling Samuel, worried about how he would react. They had not discussed children, and she was not sure if he was ready for the responsibility. She need not have worried. When she told him that evening after dinner, Samuel's face lit up like the sun. He picked her up and spun her around, then immediately set her down, worried he might hurt her or the baby. He placed his hand gently on her still flat stomach and looked at her with such love and wonder that Flora felt tears streaming down her face. "We are having a baby," he said, his voice full of awe. "Flora, we are having a baby." "Are you happy?" she asked, needing to hear him say it. "Happy," Samuel laughed. "I am over the moon. I am going to be a father. You are going to be a mother. We are going to be a family." He pulled her close and held her, and Flora rested her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat. This was everything she had never dared to dream of. A home, a husband who loved her, a baby on the way. Security and safety and love, all the things that had been so absent from her life before Samuel. The pregnancy progressed smoothly. Flora continued to work around the ranch, though Samuel became increasingly protective as she grew larger. By the time spring arrived, she was very pregnant and more than ready for the baby to arrive. Samuel fussed over her constantly, making sure she was comfortable, bringing her anything she needed, generally driving her a little crazy with his attentiveness, even as she loved him for it. Their son was born on a warm May evening in 1884, delivered by the doctor with Samuel pacing anxiously outside the bedroom door. When the doctor finally called him in, Samuel burst into the room and went straight to Flora, checking on her before even looking at the baby. "I am fine," Flora assured him, exhausted but happy. "We are both fine. Come meet your son." Samuel looked down at the tiny bundle in Flora's arms and felt his heart crack open with love. The baby was perfect, with a shock of dark hair and a red, wrinkled face. When Samuel carefully took him, the baby's eyes opened, revealing the same gray-blue color as his father's. "Hello, little one," Samuel said softly. "Welcome to the world." They named him Joseph after Samuel's father. Little Joseph Irving came home to the ranch 3 days later, and the house that had been a home now became something even more precious, the center of a family. Parenthood was harder than either of them expected, but also more rewarding. Sleepless nights and endless diaper changes, and constant worry about whether they were doing everything right. But also the joy of first smiles, the wonder of watching a tiny human grow and change, the deep satisfaction of nurturing new life. Miguel became an honorary grandfather, doting on Joseph and offering advice drawn from his own experiences raising 6 children. The ranch hands took turns carving toys for the baby, competing to see who could make the best rattles and teething rings. Even the tough cowboys turned soft when little Joseph looked at them with his serious eyes. 2 years later, Flora gave birth to a daughter. They named her Grace, for the grace that had brought Flora and Samuel together. Grace had her mother's green eyes and her father's quiet temperament, and she was adored from the moment she arrived. The years passed in a blur of children and cattle, of droughts and good seasons, of small joys and minor crises. Joseph grew into a serious, responsible boy who followed his father everywhere, learning the ranch business from the ground up. Grace was more adventurous, climbing trees and chasing after her brother, determined not to be left behind. In 1887, Flora gave birth to twin boys, Matthew and Mark. Samuel joked that they were going to run out of room in the house, but his eyes shone with pride as he held his sons. The ranch continued to prosper, and Samuel built an addition onto the house to accommodate their growing family. Flora sometimes thought back to that terrible day when the stage was attacked, when she had walked into a church bloodied and desperate. It felt like a lifetime ago, like it had happened to a different person. The frightened young woman who had been so alone had transformed into a confident wife and mother, surrounded by love and security. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Samuel surprised Flora by taking her into town for dinner at the hotel restaurant, leaving the children with Miguel and his wife. They dressed up and sat across from each other at a table with a white cloth and candles, feeling almost like strangers playing at sophistication. 10 years, Flora said, shaking her head in wonder. It feels like yesterday and forever at the same time. Best 10 years of my life, Samuel said, raising his glass of wine in a toast. To my wife, the woman who walked into church and into my heart. Flora smiled, her eyes glistening with happy tears. To my husband who gave me his coat and his pew and his life. They clinked glasses and drank, their eyes locked on each other. The love between them had only grown stronger with time, weathering all the challenges marriage and parenthood brought. They had built a life together from nothing, creating something beautiful and lasting. You ever regret it? Samuel asked. That you did not make it to Santa Fe, that you never became a governess, not even for a second, Flora said immediately. That life was not meant for me. This one was. You were. They finished their dinner and walked back through the darkened streets of Roswell, hand in hand like young courting sweethearts. The town had grown in the years since they married, new buildings and businesses springing up, but they barely noticed. They were too focused on each other. When they got home, the children were asleep, and Miguel had discreetly disappeared to the bunkhouse. Samuel pulled Flora into his arms in the privacy of their bedroom and kissed her with all the passion and tenderness of their wedding night. I love you, he murmured against her lips. Every day I love you more. And I love you, Flora replied, my cowboy who saved me. You saved me too, Samuel said. I was just surviving before you came into my life. You taught me how to live again. They made love slowly and sweetly, celebrating a decade of marriage and the promise of many more years to come. The children grew. Joseph, at 15, was already a skilled rancher, tall and strong like his father. Grace, at 13, had surprised everyone by showing an aptitude for teaching, gathering the children of ranch hands and neighbors to give them lessons in reading and writing. The twins, now 8, were hellions who kept everyone on their toes with their pranks and energy. In 1894, Flora was surprised to discover she was pregnant again at age 36. She had thought they were done having children, but apparently fate had other plans. Samuel was delighted, and the children were excited about having a new brother or sister. This pregnancy was harder than the previous ones, and Flora was confined to bed rest for the last 2 months. Samuel worried constantly, hovering over her until she threatened to throw a pillow at him if he did not give her some space. But she understood his fear. They were older now, and childbirth always carried risks. Their youngest daughter, Hope, was born on a snowy December evening, and she was worth every moment of difficulty. Small and delicate, with a cap of light brown hair and her mother's green eyes, she was the baby of the family and spoiled accordingly by her older siblings. As the new century approached, Samuel and Flora found themselves reflecting on the life they had built. The ranch was successful, the children were thriving, and their love was as strong as ever. They had weathered storms both literal and metaphorical, had faced challenges and overcome them together. One evening in the summer of 1899, they sat on the porch watching the sunset, as had become their habit. The sky was painted in shades of orange and purple, and the air was finally cooling after another scorching day. From inside the house came the sounds of the children arguing over a game, comfortable family noise that made them both smile. You ever think about that day? Samuel asked, his arm around Flora's shoulders. The day you walked into the church? Sometimes, Flora admitted. It is strange to think that something so terrible led to something so wonderful. If the stage had not been attacked, if I had made it to Santa Fe, I never would have met you. I think we were meant to meet, Samuel said. I do not usually believe in fate, but how else do you explain it? You needed help, and I was there. We fell in love so fast it should have been foolish, but it turned out to be the smartest thing either of us ever did. I walked into that church with nothing, Flora said softly. Torn dress, no money, no prospects, no hope. I just wanted somewhere safe to sit for a little while, and you gave me so much more than a coat and a pew. You gave me a home, a family, a life I never dreamed I could have. You gave me the same, Samuel said, kissing her temple. I was lost after my parents died, just going through the motions. Then you appeared, and suddenly I had a reason to live instead of just exist. They sat in comfortable silence, watching as the last light faded from the sky and stars began to appear. From the barn came the sounds of horses settling for the night. A coyote howled in the distance, answered by another. I love you, Samuel Irving, Flora said. And I love you, Flora Irving, Samuel replied, for the rest of my days and beyond. The children were grown before they knew it. Joseph married a sensible girl from a neighboring ranch and started his own spread with financial help from his parents. Grace became a teacher in Roswell, opening a proper school that served the growing community. The twins, now in their 20s, worked the ranch alongside their father, planning to take it over when Samuel was ready to retire. Hope, at 16, was considering attending normal school to become a teacher like her sister. Samuel and Flora, now in their 50s, found themselves with an empty house more often than not. It was strange after so many years of chaos and children, but it was also nice. They rediscovered the simple pleasure of each other's company, of quiet evenings reading or talking, of making love without worrying about little voices calling for them in the night. Miguel had passed away in 1905, a peaceful death in his sleep at the age of 78. They had buried him on a hill overlooking the ranch, and Samuel visited the grave regularly, talking to his old friend about the ranch and the family. Miguel's oldest son, Ricardo, had taken over as foreman, continuing his father's legacy. On a warm September day in 1910, Samuel and Flora celebrated their 28th wedding anniversary. Their children and grandchildren gathered at the ranch for a party, filling the house with noise and laughter and love. Joseph brought his wife and 3 children. Grace came with her husband and their 2 sons. The twins, still unmarried but happy, brought gifts and jokes. Hope arrived from her teaching position in Albuquerque, proud and independent. As Samuel looked around at the family they had created, he felt overwhelming gratitude. All of this had started with a moment of simple kindness, with giving his coat to a desperate woman in a church. From that small seed had grown this mighty tree of love and family and legacy. That evening, after all the guests had left, Samuel and Flora sat on their porch in the gathering darkness. They held hands, their fingers intertwined with the easy comfort of nearly 3 decades of marriage. "Thank you," Flora said suddenly. "For what?" Samuel asked. "For seeing me that day," Flora said. "Not just looking at me, but really seeing me. For treating me like a person worthy of kindness and respect when I was at my lowest. For loving me every day since." "Thank you for walking into my church," Samuel replied. "For being brave enough to keep going when everything seemed lost. For saying yes when I asked you to marry me after only 3 weeks. For building this life with me." Flora rested her head on his shoulder and they watched the stars come out one by one. Somewhere in the distance, a cow lowed. A horse whinnied in the barn. The sounds of the ranch, their ranch, the life they had built together. "If you could go back," Samuel asked, "to that day when you were deciding whether to board the stage to Santa Fe, would you change anything?" Flora considered the question seriously. That journey had been terrible. It had cost lives and caused suffering. but it had also brought her to Samuel, to this family, to this life. "No," she said finally, "I would not change a thing. Every moment, good and bad, led me here, led us here, and here is exactly where I want to be." Samuel kissed the top of her head, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair. "Me too," he said. "Me too." They sat together until the moon rose, two people who had found each other against all odds and built something lasting and beautiful. Their love story had started with violence and desperation, but had transformed into something tender and eternal. A cowboy had given a desperate woman his coat and his pew, and in return, she had given him her heart and her life. As they finally stood to go inside, Samuel paused at the door and looked back at the darkened landscape. He thought about his parents, buried on the ranch they had loved, and hoped they could see what he and Flora had created. He thought about that Sunday morning 28 years ago when a bedraggled woman had walked into church and changed his life forever. "Come on, husband," Flora said from inside, her voice warm with affection. "Let us go to bed." Samuel smiled and followed her inside, closing the door on the night. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and joys, but they would face them together, as they always had. The cowboy and the woman with the torn dress, bound together by love and fate, living out their days in contentment and peace. The ranch passed to the twins when Samuel and Flora finally retired in their 60s, moving into a smaller house in town, but visiting the ranch regularly to see their family and help with major decisions. They became the respected elder statesmen of Roswell, the couple whose love story had become local legend. People still talked about the day Flora walked into church, and Samuel gave her his coat, using it as an example of how kindness could change lives. Flora lived to see all her children married, all her grandchildren grown, and even several great-grandchildren born. Samuel remained healthy and active well into his 70s, finally slowing down only when his body insisted. They never spent a night apart if they could help it, and they never stopped holding hands when they walked on a peaceful morning in April of 1925. Flora died quietly in her sleep at the age of 67, Samuel's arms around her. He held her for a long time, whispering words of love and gratitude before finally calling for their children. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives she had touched through her kindness, her teaching, and her generous spirit. Samuel grieved deeply, but with acceptance. They had been blessed with 42 years of marriage, a lifetime of love and family. He knew he would join her soon enough, and the thought brought him comfort rather than fear. He lived another year, spending his time with his children and grandchildren, making sure the ranch was secure and the family legacy protected. He told and retold the story of how he met Flora, making sure the younger generations understood that their family had been founded on an act of simple kindness that had grown into extraordinary love. On a July morning in 1926, Samuel died peacefully at his daughter Grace's house, surrounded by family. His last words were "Flora," spoken with a smile on his face. They buried him next to his wife on the ranch, under a cottonwood tree they had planted together decades earlier. The ranch continued to thrive under their descendants, and the story of Samuel and Flora became family mythology, told to each new generation as an example of what love could be. The coat Samuel had given Flora that first day was preserved carefully, kept in a cedar chest and brought out on special occasions to remind everyone of where it all began. In the end, theirs was a simple story. A man saw someone in need and helped. A woman accepted that help with dignity and gratitude. From that moment grew love, family, legacy, and a life well lived. It was proof that kindness matters, that chance encounters can change everything, and that the best love stories often start in the most unexpected ways. A torn dress, a coat freely given, a pew shared, and two lives forever changed. That was their beginning, and the love they built from that moment lasted not just their lifetimes, but echoed through generations, a testament to the power of compassion, courage, and the human heart.